The first $100,000 is a bitch, but you gotta do it. I don't care what you have to do if it means walking everywhere and not eating anything that wasn't purchased with a coupon. Find a way to get your hands on $100,000. After that, you can ease off the gas a little bit. So this was a quote from the late Charlie Munger, and I personally concur to the broader picture or understanding behind this advice. However, I do believe that this $100,000 benchmark is a little bit outdated. So I'll be sharing my own personal real-life journey and how I look at this $100,000 milestone. Before that, I think in a similar vein, I believe in the social media space, we do see an explosion of personal finance creators that will tell you that after building your first $100,000 in capital, everything will be much better. And most of them are basically riding onto this advice from the late Munger. And if you to dive deeper into the rabbit hole of what most of them are saying, it revolves around the centrality of this concept called compounding. And the accumulation chart here basically assumes somebody saving $10,000 per year at a 7% interest. And all we have to do is to compare at every $100,000 interval what was the time taken to achieve that amount of wealth. And as you can see in the earlier years, it takes the person a boatload amount of time to accumulate the first 100,000. In fact, it's 7.8 years. But what happens next for the next 100,000? To 100 to 200k? 5.1, then 3.78, then 3 years, then 2.5. And as time goes by and the power of compounding kicks in, from 900 to 1 million, it only takes 1.35 years. And that basically outlines the eighth wonder of the world, compounding. So the issue with why some people struggle to grasp some of this personal finance concept is that your brain is essentially working against you. Personally, I've had a multitude of different conversations with people in different domains and specialization. And I do identify one common trend amongst them, especially when we go into the topic of personal finance. And I believe that the brain is not made to understand the power of the exponential curve. And many a times when we do some sort of a benchmark comparison, people just tend to write off that few percentage difference, thinking that it doesn't affect them. And one clear case study is when we always talk about fees and just that additional 1 to 2% return don't mean much, because in their mind they're probably thinking, if I stay invested for 20 years and the fees is let's say 1.5% multiplied by 20, that would potentially mean that maybe I have 20% less returns, because 20 years times 1% per year, 20% less. If I could make $100, maybe I'll make 80. And the case in point here is that comparing Warren Buffett, which is the goat of investing, versus the S&P 500 with dividends invested. So Buffett had an annual return of roughly 20% per year, while the S&P had roughly 10.4%. But the ending result, it's not just 10% times 60, which is a difference of 600%. It's not that simple. And if to compute the overall gains of the two different instruments, the S&P delivered 39,000%, while Buffett, on the other hand, delivered 5.5 million%. And that's clearly not just a 6x difference. And that's when the hockey stick part of the exponential graph kicks in. So back to the topic of compounding. I think in the personal finance space, there is this very famous rule called the Rule of 72. And it's essentially a formula used to estimate the number of years required to double the invested money at a given annual rate of return. So this is really just very simple math. If you have 1% annual return, 72 divided by 1, it will probably take around 72 years or closer to 70 years to double your money. If you up it up to 5%, 72 divided by 5, that's 14.4 years. And if you get 10%, it takes 7.2 years to double your money. And here's the very incredible thing, which is what I alluded previously as well. I'm talking about how the brain thinks linearly. So assuming that I have $100,000 today, and I compound my money at 10% per year. So it means that for every 7.2 years, I will double my money. And when you think about that, you might think, oh, cool. So after 7.2 years, 10% return, I get $100,000 to $200,000. And your brain stops functioning after that. And here comes the beauty of compounding. 7.2 years, 100,000 turns to 200,000. So let's assume that you can continue keeping up this 10% annual growth rate. So what happens at the 14.4 years mark? So you double your money again. And people often don't think about that. They just stop the computation after 7.2 years. After 14 years, if you double again, it means that the $100,000 turn to 200 and then to 400. It doesn't double from the initial capital. It doubles from that existing point. So 100 to 200 to 400. So in 14 years time, you turn $100,000 to $400,000. And what if we bring it out again to another 7.2 years? So now let's say it's roughly 21 years. So 21 years has passed. Want to take a guess how much the $100,000 is worth? It's not worth 200, it's not worth 400, it's now worth $800,000. So you basically 8x your money in 21 years. Scary, right? And what if I push it out again for another 7.2 years? So meaning to say, you compounded your money at around 10% for 28 years, because 7 times 4, 28. 28 point whatever it is, let's ignore the decimal point. Let's say you compound it for 29 years. You basically 16x your money, because from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 400 to 800, and 800 to 1.6 million in 28 years. And as I've noted here, I think in order for our monkey brain to comprehend or appreciate this power of compounding, it really only kicks in after 20 to 25 years. When you see your money 8x, 16x, that's when you think that, yeah, we are onto something here. But that said, who can really keep up to this discipline and consistency? And now we are just talking about money and your portfolio growth here. I think the same can be said for your knowledge, for your skill set. On the flip side, I think let's also not forget about inflation. And inflation is always the silent killer of investing. So yes, it sounds fine and dandy for your money to compound in the market, but don't forget, inflation is also compounding against you. So going back to that $100,000 benchmark, and it was actually a quote from the 1990s Berkshire shareholder meeting. And if I were to adjust the inflation figures from 1990 until today, the figure is probably closer to $250,000. Therefore, yes, I agree that crossing the six-figure mark gives you a feel-good factor and it makes you feel proud of yourself. But to really have a better appreciation and representation of what Munger is trying to say, I think reaching that first $250,000 would be more representative. Now, I think reflecting on my own journey, I actually came out with this new framework. Rather than looking at it at an absolute amount, because we know that everybody have different circumstances, you are born in different countries, and the standard of living is largely different. So I came up with this magic number called 50 times. You just have to multiply the average monthly income in your country by 50, and that's the tipping point when you feel like your money is working harder for you. And I'll explain why later on. And of course, this also means that when the market tanks and it goes in the reverse direction, it works equally against you. So if you're to indulge in this exercise with me, I've extracted the salaries of our fresh university graduate in my country, and the median gross monthly salary in 2024 was roughly $4,500. And using this magic number of 50, the portfolio size that we're talking about here is roughly $225,000 invested. And I'll talk more about why invested is important later on. So why 50? I think I have a few reasons for this. I think firstly, let's not discount the fact that hitting six figures is an achievement. But my feeling then, when I first crossed the six-figure mark, was that it didn't feel very impactful. In fact, when it fluctuates up and down that six-figure range, because as we know, the markets tend to be quite volatile, and sometimes it dips back down to 90 over 1,000, and then it goes back up to 100 plus range, there was some anxiety associated with it. And it feels like I didn't fully own that six-figure portfolio. So that's why I think that $100,000 mark might be a little bit outdated, and all things considered with inflation and stuff like that, I think that's not a good benchmark we should look at. Secondly, I think 50x your monthly income was also a simple way to measure the impact of volatility. Let me explain. As I said, the amount of money that we're talking about here has to be invested. And assuming that all your money is invested into the stock market via an index like the S&P 500, the usual market volatility is between plus to minus 1% on a daily basis. And just to give you a visualization, this was a chart done by Charter, and as you can see, most of the days tend to lie between that plus 1, minus 1% range. Now, if to use that 1% benchmark, it means that in any given day, your portfolio will gain or lose 2 weeks worth of your income. So I personally use 50 times because I'm using the assumption that you're not 100% allocated to the S&P. And you might have your own tactical allocation or you do your own stock picks. And based on my own experience, a 2% plus minus fluctuation is actually normal. And when the portfolio actually fluctuates 2% up down, it means that the daily volatility of your portfolio equates to 1 month of your income. And for those that know me, I think for myself, a plus minus 5% of my portfolio was quite normal too, especially in very volatile times. But I think back to the core concept here that I'm trying to explain is that 50x, because understanding or appreciating the volatility of plus minus 2% daily is equals to your monthly income will finally hit you in the gut letting you appreciate that the stock market is working for and both against you. And I think, not to sugarcoat any part of this journey, I think at the start, for myself, when I see the daily fluctuations of my portfolio equates to 1 month of my income, my emotions was definitely in the picture, and I was thinking at the back of my mind, what was I doing? Why was I so heavily invested in the market that that one day market drawdown could basically wipe out 1 month, 2 months of my efforts at my day job? And I think that just gives you the perspective and to help you kind of benchmark the daily volatility of the portfolio to something measurable and something that you probably hold quite close to your heart. And for those of you who have been following me, you know that I would try to be as transparent as possible. And I don't just show you my wins, but in fact, I think at the earlier part, the first 2-3 years of my YouTube journey, I've only been showing losses because a large part of my portfolio is allocated into the bear market. And just 5 months ago, when we saw some sort of a quick recovery and then a crash again, I actually posted in my YouTube community where I first experienced my 5-figure daily drawdown. So this drawdown was definitely more than 2 to 3x of my monthly income. And that was also when I started to reflect and devise this whole framework of how I look at portfolio drawdowns and understanding personal finance in a much broader context. And of course, on the flip side, you would have this where your portfolio starts printing green candles and you get back all the losses. So I think back to the framework of why I'm using 50 times. Firstly, I think it's a psychological benchmark. Once your portfolio actually crosses the threshold where the daily movements exceed your monthly income, then you'll feel like the load is a lot lighter, especially when the monthly contribution start to matter lesser and lesser. And on the other hand, I think there is a more mathematical way in trying to approach this benchmark number that we should all work towards, which is when your expected return actually exceed your investment contribution rate. So what do I mean by that? So let's give you an example. Using that same benchmark 4.5 thousand monthly income for a fresh grad in Singapore, assuming that you invest $2,000 per month, which is a 45% savings rate, and it's already quite respectable, that means that you are putting $24,000 per annum to work. And assuming that we use an 8% rate of return, because the S&P over the last, I guess, 20, 30, 40 years have returned roughly in line of 8 to 10%, 24,000 divided by 8%, that means that you need $300,000 invested. So I think the range here is quite wide-ranging. Let's also not try to box ourselves up. I'm thinking that once you hit this 225K or this 300K, you're good to go. In fact, investing is a lifetime journey. This is not a magic number. You shouldn't think that once you hit 300,000, you can lay on the beach, don't have to save money, and start drawing down from your portfolio. It is just a start. But personally, from my own experience, I think it's a very good goal to work towards it, because once you hit that tipping point, I think the load and the stress, the pressure on yourself to constantly save money becomes a lot lesser, because the market and the portfolio is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And the central theme here is simple. Once returns actually start to catch up or even exceed your contribution amount, you'll naturally feel that your portfolio is doing the heavy lifting. And of course, not forgetting that hopefully your income also rise alongside, and your savings will continue to have an impact because you try to save the same amount of percentage. And the end goal is always the market moving faster than you can save. And circling back to this entire discussion around how your net worth will explode after $100,000, personally, I disagree. I didn't see my net worth explode after $100,000, but true enough, after the $220,000, $250,000 range, I do feel a lot lighter and I don't feel as pressurized as before. But that said, I think the key promise here is that it's contingent of this amount of money being invested, because compounding only starts when you start taking action. So the money that we're talking about here has to be in something that can potentially yield you some form of return, because just looking at a 6-figure number in your bank will not make your life easier. You need it to work harder for you. And I usually joke around with my friends that every day I look forward to seeing how many months of salaries I've lost in the stock market. And I think to end off this entire discussion, the trinity of wealth revolves around these 3 key factors: amount invested, the time you have, and the rate of return. Of course, the best case scenario is if you have all 3, meaning you have a boatload amount of money, you have a long time horizon, and you can achieve a great rate of return. But I think just harnessing 2 of the 3 will make you incredibly rich already. So if you don't have much time left, you either increase the amount that you can invest or you increase your rate of return. And on the flip side, if you don't have a lot of capital to start with, if you're young, don't worry, because time is on your side, and just try to find something that is decently yielding. You don't have to achieve 15, 20, 30% CAGR. Just 8 to 10% with a long time period can give you an incredible amount of returns as well. So feel free to leave in the comment section down below on what you think of my framework around the magic number of 50, and I hope that my sharing actually struck a chord with you. With that in mind, I'll see you in the next video, but more importantly, And hopefully, I'll finally see you guys on the moon. Goodbye.